I spent a year working 12-hour days in a place so hot the air felt like it was trying to swallow you whole, just grinding away in the dust of West Africa and dreaming about the silence of my Montana ridge. And when I finally touched down in Bozeman with my boots caked in red dirt and my head ringing with the sound of diesel engines, I thought I was coming home to the one thing that was truly mine. But the silence I'd been craving for 12 months wasn't there. Instead, it had been buried under 3 stucco monsters and a gated entry sign that looked like it had been hammered into my soul. Because while I was away, some people decided I didn't exist anymore, and they forgot that the man they were stealing from was the same man who'd spent a decade building that life from nothing. You learn a lot about yourself when you're out there in the middle of nowhere where the heat strips you down to the bone and nobody cares what your name is or what you used to be. And after a while, the noise of the world just starts to fade away until all you want is that one patch of dirt where the wind sounds like a secret. For me, that was 40 acres outside of Bitterroot Creek, a place I'd bought 15 years ago with every cent I'd ever saved, and I'd built my little cabin on the high ground, so I could watch the storms roll in over the mountains without a single soul telling me what color my shutters should be or where I could park my truck. I'd done everything right before I left. I'd filed the paperwork with the county, I'd set the timers on the well pump, and I'd even left a note for the mail carrier. But as I rounded that final bend in my beat-up Ford, the mountain didn't oppose. To look right, it looked crowded, and my heart did this slow, heavy roll in my chest, because where my split-rail fence used to be, there was a black wrought iron gate with a gold leaf sign that read and oppose. Highlands Heritage Estates, private access, and oppose. I sat there for a long time, just letting the engine idle and watching the shadows of 3 massive, ugly mansions stretch across my grazing land. And I could see people on the porches, people in expensive outdoor kitchens flipping burgers and laughing, living their lives on my soil as if I'd never been there at all. I got out of the truck, and the air didn't oppose. Tea smelled like pine and dust anymore. It smelled like fresh sod and expensive charcoal. And as I walked up to that gate, a woman in a white tennis skirt stepped off the nearest porch and started walking toward me with this look on her face, you know, the one, that an oppose. I'm calling the manager an oppose. Look that makes you realize you're the intruder in your own life. She stopped at the bars of the gate and asked me if I was lost. Her voice as sweet as saccharine and just as fake, and when I told her my name was Silas Vance and that she was standing in my front yard, her smile didn't oppose. To even flicker, she just adjusted her visor and told me I must be mistaken because this was a private HOA development and the previous owner had abandoned the property years ago. I didn't oppose. TL, because when you've dealt with real problems in real dangerous places, you realize that yelling is just a waste of breath. So I just looked her in the eye and told her she had about 10 minutes to get off my porch before things got complicated. She laughed, a short, sharp sound that told me she thought she held all the cards. And then she introduced herself as Meredith, the president of the Highlands HOA, and she told me that under the oppose, Community Revitalization Act and oppose, my land had been declared a public nuisance and absorbed into their master plan after I failed to respond to their notices. She actually had the nerve to tell me I should be grateful because they'd oppose, improved oppose, the value of the area, and as I watched her walk back to her multi-million-dollar house built on my memories, I felt a cold, quiet clarity settle over me. The kind of feeling a hunter gets when the wind shifts in his favor, and I knew right then that I wasn't oppose. To going to just sue them. I was going to dismantle their entire world brick by brick. I spent the next 48 hours in a haze of fluorescent lights and the smell of old paper at the county records office, and what I found made the hair on my neck stand up because someone hadn't oppose. T just made a mistake. They'd committed a hit job on my identity. There was oppose. Voluntary forfeiture of title and oppose, sitting in the file with my name on it, dated 6 months after I'd left for my contract, but the signature was a shaky, jagged mess that didn't oppose. To look a thing like mine, and the witness signature below, it was even worse. It was my brother's name, Caleb, which would have been fine if Caleb had an oppose. T died in a motorcycle accident 3 years prior. The clerk behind the desk looked at the death certificate. I pulled up on my phone and then back at the forged document, and his face went as pale as the paper he was holding, and that's when I realized this wasn't oppose. T just a greedy HOA. This was a coordinated theft involving someone on the inside of the county planning board. I didn't oppose. T go back to the land that night. I went to see an old friend named Elias who'd retired from the Marshal Service and now spent his time finding people who didn't into oppos. T want to be found. And when I showed him the forged title and the photos of the mansions, he didn't into oppos. T even blink. He just poured me a glass of bourbon and told me we were going to need a bigger shovel. Elias spent 3 days digging through digital breadcrumbs while I sat in a cheap motel room staring at the ceiling. And when he finally called me over to his monitors, he showed me a web of LLCs and shell companies that all led back to a single development firm owned by Meredith's husband and a silent partner who happened to be the head of the county zoning committee. They've been doing this for years, finding into oppos, ghost properties and oppos, owned by people they thought wooed into oppos. T come back, forging the abandonment papers, and then fast-tracking the permits before anyone could ask questions, but they made one fatal mistake with me. They'd assumed I was a drifter with no ties, not a man who kept every single receipt from the last 20 years in a fireproof safe at a bank they couldn't into oppos. T-touch. We waited until the HOA's big into oppos, Founders Day into oppos, gala, a night when all the homeowners and the local bigwigs were gathered on the lawn of the largest mansion, the one built right over my old garden, and I walked through that gate with a folder under my arm and Elias trailing behind me with a GoPro strapped to his chest. The music stopped when they saw me, a dusty man in work boots and a faded shirt standing among the tuxedos and silk dresses, and Meredith stepped forward with a glass of champagne in her hand, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and fury as she told me to leave, or she'd have the sheriff arrest me for trespassing. I just smiled, and it was the most honest smile I'd had in a year, and I told the crowd of about 50 people that I had an announcement to make regarding the ground they were standing on, and then I pulled out the death certificate of my brother and the forensic analysis of the forged title that Elias had secured from a top-tier lab in Denver. I watched the color drain from the faces of the people in the front row as I explained that every single one of their homes was technically an illegal structure built on stolen land, and that because the title transfer was fraudulent, the HOA didn't end oppos. T actually owned the common areas, the roads, or the utility hookups. I did. I told them that as of 5 minutes ago, my lawyer had filed an emergency injunction and a criminal referral with the state attorney general. But since I was a reasonable man, I was willing to let them stay in their houses for the night, provided they paid the first month's into oppos, encroachment rent and oppos, of $5,000 per household, payable directly to my escrow account by midnight. The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. And then the shouting started, not at me, but at Meredith and her husband, who were trying to scurry toward the back of the house while their neighbors realized their life savings were tied up in a felony. The fallout was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. The head of the zoning committee was in handcuffs within a week, and the developer's assets were frozen so fast it made their head spin. But the real kicker was the civil suit that followed. Since the houses were built illegally on my land, the court eventually ruled that I had the right to either have them demolished at the developer into oppos, expense, or take ownership of the structures as an oppos, permanent improvements in oppos, made in bad faith. And let me tell you, there is no feeling in the world quite like sitting on your original porch, drinking a beer, and watching a crew of workers dismantle a 10,000 square foot mansion that was built on your carrot patch because the owner couldn't into oppos. T afford the back rent, I demanded. I kept one of the houses, the one that didn't and oppos. T blocked my view of the ridge, and I turned it into a sanctuary for veterans who need a place to find the same silence I once lost. And every time I see Meredith's name in the legal notices of the local paper, I just think about that hot sun in Africa and how it taught me that nothing is ever truly gone if you're willing to fight for the dirt it's buried in. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. And it's why I'm telling you this, because even though I won, there are hundreds of people out there who don an oppos. T and Elias, or a fireproof safe, or the grit to stand up to a gated community with a silver tongue. Those people just lose their homes, they lose their history, and they're told it's all in oppos, progress in oppos, by people who think a zip code makes them better than a man with dirt under his fingernails. So I have to ask you, if you came home tomorrow and found your life had been paved over, would you have the stomach to burn the system down and get it back? Or would you just walk away? I want to know what you think about this kind of an oppos. Legal and oppos. Theft. Is an HOA a community, or is it just a gang with a better wardrobe? And have you ever had to fight a war on your own front porch just to keep what was yours? Drop a comment below, and let's talk about it. Because the more we talk, the harder it is for people like Meredith to hide in the shadows of their private estates.